Okay, välkommen allesammans. We have a very special episode today. A guest who, unlike me, has some very extensive formal education on the subjects, Norse and Scandinavian mythology. Scott Shell, and he also has a great YouTube channel that I'll link down below in the description. How are you, Scott? How's it going well there today?
Great. Yeah, thank you for inviting me to talk about the elves and the hidden people. So first, I thought I should go ahead and sort of introduce myself and let your audience know exactly who I am and
what kind of background and education, things like that. People would love to hear.
Exactly. They always ask about that sort of thing. So so I am Dr. Scott Shell. I have a PhD in Germanic linguistics. I got that PhD from UC Berkeley. And when I was there, I focused a lot on linguistics, like Old High German, Old Saxon, Old English, of course, Old Norse and Hrafnagaldr. But I also taught numerous classes at Berkeley on Germanic folklore. And so that's why, of course, we're going to do this episode today. But yeah, not only did I teach courses on folklore, but I also gave various papers like over in Estonia on the hidden children. And it's just kind of been, one of my favorite subjects. So, I mean, yeah, just a couple more things, I guess. I do have a book coming out this month, actually, called The Application of Persian Semiotics, Dealing with Runology. And of course, some of my viewers already know this, but I contributed to a book called The Rune Poems, A Reawakened Tradition. And in which case, so my point here is that I'm still very active, in the community and, just trying to do everything I can for both academics and heathens alike. So.
Yep, sounds good. Sounds good. And yeah, your channel is really great. And I just saw your last video this week on the hidden people. That's I'll send people there, and you guys should all check out Scott's channel. It's especially for the continental Germanic. There's lots of people you can go to learn about the Norse sources, but the continental Germanic, they have the same religion as us. It's just different things and different sources. So definitely everyone should check out his channel. So the elves, what do you think is a good place to start on there?
All right. So the one question I always like to ask everyone when I start talking about this subject is, what is an elf? So I will get an answer for a different answer from a different given person. So let me ask you, what is an elf? What would you say an elf is?
Oh,
without even drawing on your sources either, like what would you say? Like
I know a good amount of the sources. So for someone who had not read the sources, and even me, and because I'm familiar with it and the folk tradition, and even little holidays we have around Scandinavia, elves are just these little men. People might also refer to them as Santa's helpers, or they could be little men running around causing mischief. But when you start to dive more into it, it's not just folklore. It's really a deep part of the spirituality and very symbolic and very one of the most important spiritual entities that there are that people would have regular day-to-day contact with. That's when you start to read into it a little bit more.
Yeah, definitely. They definitely have lost their sort of true importance, right, as to what they once were and what they once represented, like that.
Yeah, exactly, because that's the first thing I think people would be interested in is, the pre-Christian sources in the Eddas, Álfheimr, light elves, dark elves from the Norse beliefs, and of course they're not mentioned as much in the pagan, the origin sources as people think. So I'd like to just go over those quickly, what you have to say on that, and then use that. And what do you think kind of the most important parts are as that continued on to the folklore and tradition then?
Right. So the way that elves are depicted in, let's just use the Prose Edda, for example, Snorri, because he gives a very good description of them.
Yep.
I don't think we particularly have an exact origin story of the elves in the Eddas. Nothing is really coming to mind. I mean, of course, the dwarves with maggots and Ymir, but I don't think particularly with the dwarves. But Snorri nonetheless actually associates them, of course, with Álfheimr, who is, rather the god that rules over Álfheimr is, of course, Freyr. And he describes these light elves as being fair in appearance and very beautiful to look at, almost quote unquote intentionally angelic. However, he contrasts this to the dark elves, which he says actually live down below in the earth. and he calls these like the swarthy elves or Svart, you know, they live in Sparta.
Or Dökkálfar is the other one.
And so it's also very important for the viewers to understand that the distinction between the light elves and the dark elves is purely Snorri's invention. And it may have actually been rooted in the Christian idea of angels and demons. And in fact, it sort of comes up, it sort of makes me think about it that way, because if you read Foleyspall, at the end, it actually says that the light elves dwell at the end of Ragnarok, that the light elves dwell in a place even higher than Gimli, in a sort of very high heaven that only light elves can reside. And so that being said, again, Snorri has that sort of distinction about the light elves and the dark elves. And the dark elves are, of course, dark and swarthy, and they're nothing like the light elves. And you look at the word elf in Proto-Germanic, which is either albis or albas, depending on how you want to reconstruct that word. It means like the shining one or the noble one, or it could be like a sort of noble ancestor. And I believe that you actually made a connection to that in one of your recent videos, right?
So yeah, that's the thing, that's the main thing, of course, if we look a little bit deeper in the symbolism and some of the other mentions of elves later on, they kind of seem like ancestral spirits or related to the ancestors. But one very clear mention is the tale of Olav Geistadolf, which is a lesser known little part of a saga, and that's where the legendary Olav, a king, is buried in the mounds, and then he's basically instructs the people to bury him in a specific way, and specifically do not worship me as an elf. But then they eventually worshipped him as an elf anyway, and then he was reincarnated as Olav the Saint 150, 200 years later. So that's one very clear example of pagan belief in elves being somehow connected to the ancestors, dead ancestors.
Right, and I kind of think that Volander would be in that same light, or a similar light, to where he would be venerated as a sort of honorable ancestor, or sort of honorable heroic figure of some sort. And you know, you and I have sort of talked about this a bit, but you know, for example, álfablót versus dísablót, right? Dísablót, there's no question that it's a bloat of the Disir, and it's, or to the Disir of the Disir, if you will, but that sort of bloat is meant specifically for noble women. And we even see that Freya is the Vana Dis, right? She is the noble woman of the Disir. Contrastively, if you do look at álfablót, we see that it is a bloat to the elves, or of the elves. And we know for a fact that elves were only masculine before Britain and the oncoming of Latin and really screwing a lot of things up. They were only masculine. And so, and then Freyr, of course, is affiliated with Álfheimr and the elves as well. And so what I'm trying to say here is that you have basically dísablót, which is the bloat for the noble women, and then you probably have álfablót, which is the bloat for just noble men and noble ancestors, which also makes sense too for why they would be up there with the gods and dining with the gods. Right?
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that before, but yeah, it makes sense.
So yeah, so getting back more into the function of elves. So the function of elves is very different from the religious material, like the Eddic material. They actually do have agency, but they are not, going back to the sort of prototypical idea of an elf, they are not little men making presents for Santa by any stretch of the imagination. And they are really responsible for causing disease and causing mischief. And there's just nothing really that great about them. So it also makes you wonder too, if that álfablót was actually sort of there to appease the ancestors so people wouldn't piss them off and get sick, for example.
We spoke about that.
Right, you know, so, and so the next example is usually tied to elves in taking people into the mountain. So this is a very common motif. What would usually happen is that somebody, you know, in a rural village would hear a voice calling him into the moor or into the forest, and then of course often into the mountains. And what would happen is that this person would follow the voice, and this would be the voice of an elf, usually an elven woman at this point. So you can already tell how late this is, because as I had just said before, elves were only male ancestors.
Yeah.
But either way, what would happen is that usually it was like a young boy would get lured into the mountain or lured into the forest. And when they would come back, they were declared insane. They couldn't string sentences together. They were out of their wits. They didn't know where they were. And quite often they were also rendered as mentally ill.
On in like Scandinavia or Germany or even England, and that folklore they later turned on to fairies sometimes, but do the elves always have kind of the same function in the different countries, or can that be different too?
They generally all cause disease. That's a commonality. The nightmare is a bit different. That was actually associated with like night and mare, which is like a night creature that causes you nightmares, right? But in German, I think German is the only one that we actually have like Albtraum, where it's like literally an elf dream. But to talk about these functions real quick, like you were talking about just a minute ago, the functions get extremely distorted in probably like later Old English into really like Middle English times, especially around like medieval theology, because what happens is that these people want to create like Latin glosses for a lot of these words like elves. And what happens is that they use words like orcus, which is an orc. So that word orc actually is not a Germanic word whatsoever. Or they'll use the word nymph and assign a nymph to some sort of like water elf. Now, you can already see the problem there because you're blending two different worldviews. You're blending two different semantic spheres, if you will. And you'll see the dryad, for example, was actually used as like a female elf, I believe. And so that's actually where you start getting the female elves, is because of the later British tradition that came in and started to give us these Latinate words which were female and like map them onto these words for elves. So you can see right there, that's when everything starts getting all messy.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, it makes sense. The more time that goes by, the further the information gets lost pretty much and distorted.
So I have one more example for you regarding elves and the folklore tradition. This one is particularly strange. It has to be rooted in heathen practice. It has to be. Because what happens is that the elves will come around New Year's Eve, in which case was the exact same time as Christmas Eve, according to the people telling the story. So they at least believed that they were the same day. And they believed that New Year's Eve was Christmas Eve. And what would happen is that a lot of these people would need to go to church, but they needed somebody to stand guard to make sure, like, I don't think that reason's ever really stated, but probably so that the elves wouldn't move from one location to another. That's another common motif. It's called elves moving house. But what happens is that this one person volunteers to guard the crossroads to make sure that the elves cannot, like I said, cross over. And when this person does this, the way that he is allowed, or the way that he sort of controls them from not crossing to the other side, is that he withstands them, he resists them, because what they're supposed to do is they're supposed to tempt him with wonderful ale and mead and wonderful foods and just things that you can't resist, and these beautiful treasures. And if you do not acknowledge them, so you cannot talk to them, and you pretty much have to just be silent and not acknowledge them whatsoever. If you do that, then they will eventually leave, and you will be left with all these, delicious foods and all of these wonderful treasures that you are allowed to keep. Of course, most of the stories don't end up that way. So what happens is, for example, the person will try to resist, and then they're like, oh, but I really like those bacon drippings. so they give into it. And when they give into it, then all of the treasures disappear, all of the food disappears, and then you're rendered as just insane. So it's like being taken into the mountain again. So you go back to the village, you're out of your wits, you're not making a whole lot of sense, and which actually ties into possibly journeying. That's why I wanted to bring this up, because of the whole crossroads thing. You're at a crossroads, you're at a threshold, and specifically in these stories, specifically in a story by Jacqueline Simpson that I just recently reread again, it said there that that person who went insane was doing utiseta. He was literally sitting out. And it's very rare that you can actually see an example where somebody is sitting out for that kind of purpose. And so if you put it into the context of sitting out in utiseta and what he was actually doing with communicating with elves and everything, it seems like there was some sort of like journeying or something that was going on.
Okay, so to kind of build on to what we were just speaking about, the elves, whatever they may be, it's pretty clear that they were venerated in some way and that people would prefer not to be on their bad side. So if people were to, do any practices or worship or rituals, are there any attestations and sources that speak about how people might do that to make benefit from the elves in order to ward off disease or gain power or good luck or prophecy, things like that, just to not be on their bad side, basically?
Yeah, I mean, so as far as not be on their bad side, like I said before with the álfablót thing, that actually makes a ton of sense, right? They want to sort of steer clear of those diseases. And so they might actually appease the ancestors by giving them these offerings. We are familiar with things called like Elven Mills. I don't know if are you familiar with those?
No.
So there's like a cup in a stone, right? So you have like a stone, and basically there's a cup that someone sort of makes, or maybe it was even like a natural indentation. And historically, those were actually associated with elves too. And what people would do to presumably appease the elves is that they would leave offerings in those cups. That's why they're called Elven cairns or something like that, or Elven Mills. And in fact, it's from this book here, Trolldom. So anyone wants to check that out. The author, Johannes Gardbach, who is just fantastic, talks about how people would prime that cup with butter. And so that's actually historically accurate too. So, I mean, if you're going to leave an offering in one of those stones, one of those stone cups, make sure you bring a stick of butter, I guess, right? So and then what happened is that they would butter that area, and then they would place the offering in the cup once they sort of primed it with butter. So, I mean, going off of that too, there are all kinds of other instances in this book, so I highly recommend it, to your audience. But there are all kinds of practices in here dealing with elves to sort of appease them, like you were just saying, and to make sure one doesn't get sick, for example.
I'm taking like 2 Patreon questions here. I think we've answered most of them just in this video, but a couple quick ones. Okay, we have a question here from MN. Do you see the elves as a metaphor for legendary ancestors on some level or another level, specifically speaking about pre-Christian sources, maybe not even in the sagas or Eddas, but is there any other maybe linguistic evidence or runic inscriptions or things like that that you can think of?
So I wouldn't look at them as metaphors, because they are. They are actually just dead ancestors. There's no reason to actually draw that metaphor. I think that might come from this sort of modern contemporary understanding of what we think of when we hear the word elf, and then we want to sort of create the metaphor. Really, later on with all these crazy ideas with Christmas elves and stuff like that, that's not what they thought about back then anyway. So there's no reason to actually have to project from today onto then and sort of create the metaphor, because again, they were dead ancestors. Right? Or maybe it's just the fact that they are that sort of high noble ancestor. Because again, if you link it to the Dis or the Disir, and you have Freya being the noble woman of the Vanir, there's nothing about a Dis that needs to be a part of the soul, right? That's just sort of like the disposition of the being or the figure. And we know, for example, that in Old English, we have all kinds of names that are recorded that have the word elf in them. And these figures were actually very noble people. So some examples here are Alfred, which is literally elf council. And we have álfrek, which is like elf power. We have elf beorst, which is elf bright. And we have elf noth, in which case is, I think, elf valor or something like that. And so the majority of these names are actually recorded, like I said, with instances of men with high noble rank. So going back to the soul thing again, I think it's more of a status and disposition that one becomes or is an elf, just like the dis, like the noble woman. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe there's some sort of idea tied to the soul, but if we are contrasting it to like the Isablot and Álfablót and the dis versus the elf, then it makes more sense for like rank and disposition to me anyway.
Yeah, very interesting, and those names, right? The Alfreds and especially the Old English name. It tends to be like kings and noble class people, right?
Yeah,
you don't
exactly.
see regular people a lot with those names. Is that
no,
right?
I mean, nowadays, yes, but of course the belief system isn't here anymore.
Yeah.
So like the name Alfred is still somewhat common, I think.
Yeah. Very cool.
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing to speak about. Okay, yeah. Is there anything else that you'd like to speak about the elves? I think we've answered all the questions that have come in and spoken about a lot of things. Anything else that you feel is maybe important to add?
So first and foremost, I am an educator, of course. So to that end, what I wanted to do is go ahead and recommend some sources for your audience.
Yeah, yes, please.
Because I do know what it's like not having a clue as to what you're doing, and you go to random Google and you say books on fairies, and it's already, like I said, the word fairy is already problematic too, because that's actually a Latin term. My point is, though, is that you don't really know what the heck you're going to get yourself into. So as I had mentioned before, there's Trolldom by Johannes Gardbuck, right? So I guess we can go ahead and put these in the description below.
Yeah, I can put them in the description and put it up on the screen here too.
And we have, this is one of my personal favorites. This is Scandinavian Folk and Belief, or Scandinavian Folk Belief and Legend by Fiddling and Semsdorf. This is excellent, especially for any of your viewers who want to go beyond the elves, but want to really understand that soul complex system, because there are tales in here about the hoog, which is like your mind stealing your neighbor's milk or something like that. There's tales in here about death and the Fylgja and so on and so forth. So yeah, I highly recommend this one. I used this to teach at Berkeley. So really good.
I got that one just recently, last year sometime, and it's just, we have books of folk tales all over, and you can read the folk tales, like stories like that, but that one is just so good at like taking little excerpts and organizing it by subject like that. So it's perfect. It's like an encyclopedia for people who want to get into this stuff more.
Yeah, definitely. It's also a nice read just to lay down and read a couple stories and then you pass out. So this is also one of my personal favorites. I use this at Berkeley as well. This is by Jacqueline Simpson. This is, there we go, Icelandic Folk Tales and Legends. So Jacqueline Simpson is just an all-around really good scholar. And she actually wrote an article called The Ambiguity of Elves, which inspired me to ask you, what is an elf? Because she kind of goes through that and talks about what an elf actually is. So really good scholar there. Just two more. I got one here by, actually I lied, I got a few more. I got one here called...
People are thirsty for this information, I'm sure.
Hey, look, this is the thing, right? It's like, if you're really dedicated and really, truly, honestly interested in pursuing these things, you're going to want this kind of information. So hopefully some people do get something out of it.
Absolutely.
This is the tradition of household spirits. So ancestral lore and practices. This is actually by Claude Luckatu right there. This is really cool because of course, it talks about the folk tradition, and it talks about, these house spirits that you're supposed to interact with. But they actually, he actually goes through and gives you certain pictures, for example, of where you see this art, right? And tales sort of tied to how one should integrate the belief system into the house and into the practice. And Claude Luckatu is an amazing folklorist. He's got a PhD. I mean, he's just really good, really knows his stuff. And then we'll just, I'll just mention one more because it's Grimm. So this is by Jack Zeitz. That is called The Complete First Edition of the Brothers Grimm. So if you're looking for a good translation of the Brothers Grimm, right there by Jack Zeitz. So.
Yeah, and those books, the third one you mentioned, I hadn't read, so I'll have to check that one out. But also the great thing about those books is the Scandinavians can find these, or a German can find these written pretty easily, and lots more sources even. But in English, it's still very valuable because you'll get some scholar who did it in the past, few decades, and they have a way of organizing it in a way that is not there in the original Scandinavian sources. So it's very valuable. You're not missing out on anything if you don't speak Scandinavian on these.
Yeah, totally. Definitely.
Yeah. All right. So that's a good episode, and I hope people have gotten some spiritual guidance out of this and found some value in it. But that's thank you so much. I learned a lot too, and hope to speak again soon. Thank you, Scott.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.